Gives me great pleasure to introduce Natika Washington. Natika, actually, I met through one of Roger's partners at Voice Place, Scott, whom I know quite well, and said, Cindy, you have to meet Natika. And there was an email going back and forth. I had the pleasure of having a good conversation with Natika, probably about 3 months ago, Natika, I think.
Yeah, about 3 months.
And I was inspired by her own personal story of her journey. This is a woman who's bold, who's got more courage than so many of us, because she says it's bullshit and lead and act like a queen with confidence. And so her voice is strong. And she's also the vice president of corporate partnerships at the Prison Fellowship in Greater Chicago area. She's helping change policy. We've seen what's happened across the US. And I let her tell her story. So I'm so happy that you're here with us today. And there's a good mix of Canadians here today, as well as people. I don't think we've got any overseas, but we definitely have the Canadians and Americans. So over to you, Natika, and I'll be your Vanna. And everybody is looking forward to hearing your story of how to overcome the bullshit and lead like a queen. And I love the look.
Thank you. Gosh, after Roger, I'm just like, wow. So now you guys get to listen to me speak. So I expect to have some healthy conversation after this conversation on how I present it. So I'm happy to be here. As you guys all know, my name is Natika Washington. I've spent the better part of my career working to fight for equitable opportunities, no matter for race or gender. So as we were just talking earlier, my story along the way has been quite interesting. I've experienced a lot of BS in my personal kind of perseverance to overcome and to achieve my leadership. And so I hope that I can just have a conversation today with y'all, and it'll be helpful to you and anyone else in your orbit that you think could learn from this conversation. So when I was in utero, an evangelist during a local revival prophesied that I would change the world, sit amongst kings and queens, and work alongside world leaders. Naturally, I heard this story a fair number of times growing up. And if you're a religious person, you know of prophecy. As an adult, I absolutely believe my path was destined for greatness in the space of leadership because of this prophecy. But what destiny doesn't tell you is that you're not gonna run up against adversity, sexism and racism along the way on that journey. So a bit about me. I grew up in a middle American town called Peoria, Illinois. I'm the middle of 4 children raised in a traditional Christian Black home. My father is the senior pastor, and my mother is the first lady of a church called United Fellowship Ministries, which is on the south side of Peoria in the heart of the Black community. I'm passionate about community service, and faith and family are core to what I believe. And so as we grew up, like most families in the 80s, we didn't have a lot of money, but our family was really close. As a matter of fact, I remember when I was growing up, spending summers with my 10 cousins at my grandparents' house, catching fireflies, dreaming up the next sneaky adventure of our Sneaky Pigs Secret Cousins Club. I remember Saturday and Sunday church fairs with Ferris wheels and cotton candy and dunk tanks to try to raise money for our satellite church partners in South Africa. All of these memories were of a life that my parents, Gregory and Wanda, wanted to create for their children. They always would say to us when we were little, everything we're doing is because we want you kids to have a better life than we had. So they supported my dreams of wanting to be the next Olympic cheerleader or world-class dance performer because they wanted their children to accomplish their dreams. I believe that prophecy that the evangelist spoke over my life before I was even really developed in my mother's womb. As a kid, your parents tell you many things that you find hard to believe, but as an adult, you have moments of wisdom to remember those stories and real actions playing out in your life. Because I have sat amongst kings and queens, worked alongside world leaders, and every day, little by little, trying to change the world in my own way. Next slide. So I was the most unlikely candidate in the US Air Force. I had limited knowledge of what our US forces did, let alone did I understand the emotional or mental and physical toll the dedication of being in the US Air Force for 10 years would actually play on this girl's body. The one thing I had was God and an unbelievable determination to write a path for this little Black girl that could. The Air Force was my only path in this story to achieve the dreams I speak of today. My parents were struggling blue-collar Blacks without knowledge of financial resources needed or earned to send any of their children to college. But they managed to work really hard to own our family home in a neighborhood that would give their children and kids the education that would not only expand our early minds, but also put us in proximity to people, cultures, events, and information most Black kids didn't have in those days. When my dad came up with this warped plan of me enlisting into the military after only a year of junior college, I agreed. So I enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1998 and learned that the military would teach me a lot of valuable skills at a very young age. Skills like time management or team building, conflict resolution, tactical defense, and leadership. You guys see that photo right there? That was me. I believe I was 18 years old and I'm going through security forces technical training, practicing how to shoot a machine gun. I believe that is an M249. So the military afforded me the opportunity to live in a lot of different places. I was in San Antonio, Minot, North Dakota, South Carolina, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. I deployed to Bahrain and Iraq after September 11th, and where I spent 9 months fighting for our country. Those experiences, though broad, also not ones that I would ever forget, including experiences of racism and discrimination. But to this day, I actually value all of those experiences. Next slide. I learned to sink or swim. The military forced me to break down barriers within my own beliefs of who I was as a Black woman, how far I could physically push my body to achieve unrealistic levels of stress, and my personal perseverance to achieve promotable accomplishments. After joining the US Air Force in 1998, I began realizing the differences, however, in attitudes, perceptions, and roles from a gender perspective. The natural competitive nature of a career field like law enforcement paired with the expectation of equal practices was all but non-existent in the late 90s. Women had to learn the dynamics and overcome gender norms while being competitive in a patriarchal system that was built for men to succeed. Females weren't even allowed to join my career field until 1984. I would learn that the challenges I faced as a woman from a discrimination and sexual harassment platform would grow, and that the institution I joined was behind in their ability to be inclusive, reactive, and progressive. As a young African-American woman in a male-dominated career field, the institutionalized gender norms and inequalities that women experienced, such as sexual harassment and discrimination, are still prevalent, unfortunately, today. In fact, I remember my first public discrimination act against me. The event sticks out because it happened really early in my career. I was just notified that I would be deploying to Kuwait Air Force Base. I was newly married, and I had been making a name for myself in my new squadron, and I was up for an early promotion. So I'm deploying to Kuwait. I'm the only female assigned to a 15 team member convoy squad. Our job was to basically transport all of the military personnel coming into Kuwait safely to their bases or locations in the country or on the border. My flight leader from my home station in the United States was a Caucasian male by the name, we'll leave his name out, actually, from North Carolina. And he was not afraid to express his personal views about how he felt about race, but especially how he felt about women in the career field. His next words to me would be shocking. He was getting ready to announce the new promotion. It was a promotion called Senior Airman Below the Zone. And I'm sitting there waiting. I was up for the promotion with only one other person in the squadron who also happened to be on that team with me. And he announces that I was the winner. So naturally, I'm super excited, waiting for him to congratulate me. But instead, in front of a room of 30 men, he says, "Well, boys, let's calm down. We all know the only reason Washington beat Perez is because she has big tits and everybody wants to fuck her." Now imagine you are a 20-year-old Black girl receiving that message from your leader. How would you act in that moment? How would you act after? I chose to go high. I made it clear that discrimination and sexual harassment are unprofessional and demoralizing. I thanked him and I kept my head up while I did that. But those events that took place in Kuwait paved a road along my military path that I would not anticipate, but also would set me up for my future work. I immediately knew in that moment that it was time for me to be in a position of power. So I started working to transition out of that world. I was promoted when I returned back from Kuwait to a new position in the career field, working to do training and development for all of the new airmen and current military members in our squadron. You have to live your values is one of the things that I learned very earlier on. Shortly after transitioning into that role, my leadership also realized that there was a need to focus in on ethics and behavior. And so they requested that I stand up an ethical behavioral training program for all of our new incoming security force members and train the current staff members. Because I didn't want another woman to experience what I experienced and didn't think that any person, regardless of their race or gender, should be treated that way. After my tour in the Air Force as military police, I realized it was time for something different. So I worked really hard and was accepted to become a special air missions flight attendant with the 89th Airlift Wing and the 1st Airlift Squadron out of Andrews Air Force Base. For those of you who aren't familiar with that mission in the United States, we are the mission that transport the President and the Vice President of the United States, so Air Force One and Air Force Two. For 4 years, I worked for the Bush administration, transporting former Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretaries of State and Defense Rumsfeld and Wright around the world, along with other Joint Chief of Staff of our military branches. Our job as a flight attendant was to provide safe and 5-star service to all of our customers. We transported our nation's leaders to the Middle East to begin some of the first discussions in those days to develop a new Middle East peace process with Arab nations and other allies. We cooked 5-star meals for 140 customers at 35,000 miles in the air. We baked brownies for the BBC reporter that was no longer covering the Secretary of State because his favorite dessert was brownies. Even still, I was just really mesmerized by many of the leaders I'd worked with and began asking questions about their leadership paths. I knew I had a desire to be great one day, but needed guidance on how I could achieve it. I was particularly interested in careers at the US Department of State, but one of the messages that came across from all of those conversations that I had with leaders were identify your allies or mentors and be prepared to network to get you where you are. So I never go at it alone. I have to say much of my success is because of my strong community of supporters that I've had in my back. But by networking, I was granted an internship that would turn into an 8+ year foreign affairs career at the State Department, traveling the world to fight for gender equality. I figured, since I had just learned how to network, that I would also take my chances in reaching out to Carol Perez, who I used to work with when I was a flight attendant on Secretary of State trips. Carol was a senior foreign service officer at the State Department at the time, and she worked for Secretary Rice's Administration Bureau. And she just happened to have a job at the time and said, "You want to know what, Natika? I think this would be a good job for you." While it wasn't my dream job, I knew that it was the job that I needed to get my foot in the door. And so in this photo here, it's my first year as a full-time employee at the State Department. And we had a holiday party with Secretary Rice. And so that was all compliments of Carol Perez. Carol would eventually go on in my 8-year career to become a formal mentor and really help guide the growth of my career as a foreign affairs professional. I learned that you have to shoot your shot. To get into the State Department, I had to work with the military to negotiate an exit on my contract early. To get the job at the State Department, I had to have courage to reach out to Carol Perez. And I had to make moves that I wanted for my dream, because you'll have people that are that have your back, but it's up to you to help yourself first. Carol Perez and all of my mentors have always pushed me to meet with people, to learn from what other people were doing, and to be brave. I always found that they were willing to listen, and in some cases willing to act on my behalf in order for me to achieve my success. One of the things that I learned along the way is reach across racial divides, and being inclusive of all genders, including women, is very important. Many of the mentors along my path have not always been people of color. They have not always been women, but they have come to my life bringing a variety of expertise that has really helped me along the way. So now I'm at the State Department. I have the job that I needed, and I realized that I needed to hustle in order to get to where I wanted to be, which was a true career in foreign affairs. And as I began working for Carol Perez, I also began seeing many doors opened. I was hired as the executive scheduler to coordinate with the Department of Defense to secure all of Secretary Clinton's domestic travel, and pinged to travel with her as the official representative of the State Department. So my plan to transition into foreign policy was definitely underway. Within a year, I would meet my current mentor and future boss, Anita Body. Anita was then the chief of staff to Secretary Clinton's top gender office, and she was looking to staff up. So she approaches me with this opportunity that I couldn't refuse. She had an opportunity to head up a gender office, and she needed someone to be the new head of programs focused on empowering women and girls globally. So my job was going to basically be to identify and fund the impactful solutions in developing worlds that would improve girls' health, education, and economic mobility. It was my dream job. Working for Secretary Clinton also provided me this unlikely ascent to leadership, because in being in proximity to the many of people and leaders that came in my life, I was able to be exposed to a world where I was able to help other people, and I had no clue that that was going to be an opportunity for me. So now I'm in my dream job. I'm the top gender, the head of Secretary's top gender programming office. And it's my job to design and implement and oversee a $70 million grant budget. We had 350 programs in over 100 countries. So there was a lot going on, and I was new to this space. On a daily basis, I worked on amazing initiatives. I developed partnerships with the Cherie Blair Foundation to empower African women entrepreneurs to scale their businesses. We actually got an opportunity to travel the world, to travel to Africa, to meet with Elder Bishop Desmond Tutu, to also thank him and the Desmond Tutu Foundation for their partnership to empower women in Africa. I think I have a photo of that here as well. I also had an opportunity to provide education to children in the South Asian countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, or working with women entrepreneurship collectives who were looking to get access to grow their businesses. I was able to do so many amazing things because I met the right people and was able to position myself in a way for them to trust and believe that the expertise that I was bringing would actually help us achieve our goals of equality. Not only was it important to achieve global gender equality, it was also important for the State Department to practice what we preach. So we were traveling around the world trying to help other countries realize the importance of including the other half of their population. But we also needed to make sure that we as an organization or an agency within the government was doing the same. It's so easy to practice or to preach and not practice what we preach. And so my job was to help the State Department implement a new gender integration policy that would essentially train all of our staff and offices to be inclusive of gender components across our staffing, our strategic planning, and our budgeting components. It actually kind of makes sense in hindsight when I look back on my experiences and see exactly how everything led to this role. My military experience, heading up the ethical behavioral training program, meeting foreign leaders through the Air Force and the State Department. You really have to find what you believe in. And once you do that, you will ultimately end up where you belong. So after 6 years of working at the State Department, I decided it was time to start thinking about building my own legacy. In thinking, I realized I needed a plan to build my family's wealth, which at the time was just me. So my research led to me choosing to get an MBA. So I enrolled in George Washington University's Executive MBA program. One of the things that I also learned in climbing the career ladder at the State Department is that it mattered in DC where you went to school. But some of the things that I didn't realize when it comes to lack of access to education would ultimately affect my path to generational wealth. So less than 10% of MBA students are Black, and Blacks who choose to go get an MBA accrue about 100,000 in student debt. So most people would ask, if the average white family makes 8 times more wealth than that of a Black family, why would we choose such a risk? Why would I put myself in financial debt to achieve someone else's version of creating generational wealth? I can only speak to my story. And so my story was, I had a dream at the time, and still do, of transitioning out of government into a corporate social responsibility career in a major corporation. I did not think a big corporation would take a risk on this little Black girl unless I had a fancy degree. I put myself in financial debt because at the time, I did not have the knowledge or the stats before I enrolled in GW. It just goes to prove why I do what I do with sharing and giving, making sure that people have access to information, because there's still a major information gap amongst my community, and yes, even the educated Black community. So I work tirelessly on equal access and equitable opportunities for people who need information that I've learned. One thing that I know is that generational wealth is important, but not at the risk of financial debt or ruin. So I am on a path to determine the safest and most effective way to build generational wealth for my family, and if successful, for other communities that may benefit. So I graduate with my MBA, and I'm transitioning out of government into what I thought was going to be corporate, but I transitioned into a nonprofit career, which has been phenomenal as well. So 25 million people worldwide are deprived of the freedom to choose how they live and work. Polaris is one of the nation's largest anti-human trafficking organizations working to combat forced labor. During my tenure as the Chief Development Officer, I worked for partnerships with corporations to address trafficking in their supply chains. I worked with the Mexican and US government to stand up shared global hotlines to report real-time instances of human trafficking occurring between our borders. I increased Polaris's annual revenue by 3% annually and secured a $1 million strategic partnership with Delta Airlines to address human trafficking in Delta Airlines supply chain. But despite loving that mission, I realized the culture was not a good fit. Another skill that I learned along this leadership journey is don't try to force a working relationship when the visionary is not ripe for change. As I began transitioning from Polaris, I had what us Christians call a God moment. While planning to meet with a potential donor for Polaris, they invited me to meet at the Prison Fellowship headquarters. Long story short, that meeting introduced me to the new CEO of Prison Fellowship, who was offering me a new job. I had to pray about my next move. So I decided to take the leap and join the Prison Fellowship team. I would say that faith, no doubt, played a role with my decision to join this National Criminal Justice Reform Organization, but it really wasn't the only thing. Right before I joined, I also learned that I would be expecting my first son. So while surprised, being a mother has been the greatest accomplishment that I've ever achieved. But I was transitioning to a national Christian conservative organization as a single pregnant woman. To say that I was concerned was an understatement. But great leaders see the potential in their employees before they take a chance on them. When I informed my current boss of my pregnancy, he responded by saying, "We're hiring you because you're qualified, and babies are a blessing from God. You're gonna be great, and you're gonna love being a mom." As the first Black vice president in senior leadership, I have increased Prison Fellowship's corporate and foundation revenue by 8% year over year in the 3 years I've been with this organization. My recent accomplishments also include negotiating partnerships with companies like Hobby Lobby and the government to completely transform the criminal justice system in a state, specifically focused on women's incarceration rates in that particular state. Celebrate differences without fear or condemnation is something that I truly believe. When you have support from leaders free of judgment, one of the things that I learned is that all parties can come to the table open to really be willing to embrace the differences. And so I was blessed to be working with a leader that saw the diversity that I brought to the team, but also encourages and supports the differences of our staff. So here's my little human. This is Chancellor Washington. He's 3, full of love and spirit, and has his mother's inquisitive nature to explore and learn new things. We currently live in Chicago, and so many people ask me, what's next on this journey of yours? And there are a couple of things. I'll say right now, I am navigating the country's school system. Yes, my son is gearing up to go to kindergarten, so I am trying to figure out where he'll go from there. I'm also gearing up for a potential transition out of the nonprofit sector into the private sector. I'm hopeful that I'll find a corporate social responsibility role in some large corporation in the future. And as you can see, I have political aspirations. So at some point in my life, in the next 4 to 5 years, I anticipate that I'll be running for public office. You know, my passion and heart has been community and public service. So it makes sense that I would end my career doing that and serving my country. So that's a little bit about me. I'll just leave you guys with a couple of values that I learned along the way in the hopes that they'll be useful. So some of those are live your values, network and listen and trust and act on the information that is coming to the forefront.
Again, thank you, Natika. I know others may well reach out to you. I hope they do. And as well, I'll be following up with materials later. But thank you so much for sharing your time and sharing your journey and sharing your beautiful son.